This handbook describes the various environmental conditions affecting human survival and describes isolated personnel, activities necessary to survive during successful evasion or isolating events leading to successful recovery. It is the fundamental reference document providing guidance for any USAF service member who has the potential to become isolated. Deviations require sound judgment and careful consideration. This publication provides considerations to be used in planning and execution for effective mission accomplishment of formal USAF survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, SERE, training, environmentally specific SERE training, and combat survival continuation training programs. The tactics, techniques, and procedures in this publication are recognized best practices presenting a solid foundation to assist USAF service members to maintain life and return with honor from isolating events. Shelter is anything that provides protection from environmental hazards. The environment influences shelter site selection and factors which IP must consider before constructing an adequate shelter. The techniques and procedures for constructing shelters for various types of protection are also presented. The location and type of shelter built by IP vary with each situation. There are many things to consider when picking a site, such as the time and energy required to establish an adequate shelter, weather conditions, life forms, human, plant, and animal, terrain, and time of day. Every effort should be made to use as little energy as possible and yet attain maximum protection from the environment. Late afternoon is not the best time to look for a site which will meet that day's shelter requirements. IP should not wait until the last minute to build shelter, as they may be forced to use poor materials in unfavorable conditions. They must constantly be thinking of ways to satisfy their needs for protection from environmental hazards. Weather conditions are a key consideration when selecting a shelter site. Failure to consider the weather could have disastrous results. Weather factors such as temperature, wind, and precipitation can influence the IP's choice of shelter type and site selection. Situating a shelter site in low areas such as a valley and cold regions can expose the IP to low night temperatures and wind chill factors. Colder temperatures are found along valley floors and are sometimes referred to as cold air sumps. It may be advantageous to situate shelter sites to take advantage of the sun. The shelter site could be situated in an open area during the colder months for added warmth, or in a shaded area for protection from the sun during periods of hotter weather. In some areas, a compromise may have to be made. For example, in many deserts the daytime temperatures can be very high while low temperatures at night can turn water to ice. Protection from both heat and cold are needed in these areas. Shelter type and location should be chosen to provide protection from the existing temperature conditions. Wind can be either an advantage or a disadvantage depending upon the temperature of the area and the velocity of the wind. During the summer or on warm days, IP can take advantage of the cool breezes and protection the wind provides from insects by locating their camps on knolls or spits of land. Conversely, wind can become an annoyance or even a hazard as blowing sand, dust, or snow can cause skin and eye irritation as well as damage to clothing and equipment. On cold days or during winter months, IP should seek shelter sites which are protected from the effects of wind chill and drifting snow. The many forms of precipitation, rain, sleet, hail, or snow, can also present problems for IP. Shelter sites should be out of major drainages and other low areas to avoid potential flash floods or mudslides resulting from heavy rains. Snow can also be a great danger if shelters are placed in potential avalanche areas. All life forms, human, animal, and plant, must be considered when selecting the shelter site and the type of shelter that will be used. Human life forms may mean the enemy or other groups from whom IP wish to remain undetected. For a shelter to be adequate, various factors must be considered, especially if an extended isolating situation is expected. Insect life can cause personal discomfort, disease, and injury. By locating shelters on knolls, ridges, or other areas that have a breeze or steady wind, IP can reduce the number of flying insects in their area. Staying away from standing water sources will help to avoid mosquitoes, bees, wasps, and hornets. Ants can be a major problem, and some species will vigorously defend their territories with painful stings, bites, or pungent odors. Animals can also be a problem, especially if the IP's shelter site is situated near their trails or water holes. Some plants may be hazardous to the IP. Thorn bushes, trees, and vines can cause injuries. Dead trees that are standing, and trees with dead branches, should be avoided. Wind may cause them to fall, causing injuries or death. Poisonous plants, such as poison oak or poison ivy, must also be avoided when locating a shelter. Avalanche, rock, or mudslide areas should be avoided. These areas can be recognized by either a clear path or a path of secondary vegetation, such as 1 to 15 foot tall vegetation or other new growth which extends from the top to the bottom of a hill or mountain. Dry stream beds should also be avoided due to the danger of flash flooding. Rock overhangs must be checked for safety before being used as a shelter. The basic principles of shelter requirements and planning are: be near areas to meet the I.P.'s needs such as water, food, fuel, and a signal or recovery site. Be a safe area, providing natural protection from environmental hazards. Be near sufficient materials to construct the shelter. If possible, IP should try to find a shelter which needs little work to be adequate. In some cases, the shelter may already be present. IP limit themselves if they assume shelters must be a fabricated framework having predetermined dimensions and covered with material. IP must consider the amount of energy required to build the shelter. If nature has provided a natural shelter nearby, which will satisfy the I.P.'s needs, use what is already there. A complete construction of a shelter is not necessary. This saves time and energy. This does not rule out shelters with a fabricated framework and parachute or other manufactured material covering. It simply enlarges the scope of what can be used as a survival shelter. For example, rock overhangs, caves, large crevices, fallen logs, root buttresses, or snowbanks can all be modified to provide adequate shelter. Modifications may include adding snow blocks to finish off an existing tree well shelter, increasing the insulation of the shelter by using vegetation or parachute material, or building a fire reflector in front of a rock overhang or cave. See Figure 13.1 for examples of naturally occurring shelters. Be large enough and level enough for the IP to sit up, with adequate room to lie down and to store all personal equipment. An adequate shelter provides physical and mental well-being for rest, which is vital if IP are to make sound decisions. The need for rest becomes more critical as time passes and rescue or return is delayed. Before actually constructing a shelter site, IP must determine the specific purpose of the shelter. The type of shelter to be fabricated is influenced by climate, weather, insects, availability of nearby materials, manufactured or natural, length of expected stay, enemy presence, number and physical conditions of IP. The size limitations of a shelter are important only if there is either a lack of material on hand or if it is cold. Otherwise, the shelter should be large enough to be comfortable yet not so large as to cause an excessive amount of work. Any shelter, naturally occurring or otherwise, in which a fire is to be built, must have a ventilation system which will provide fresh air and allow smoke and carbon monoxide to escape. Even if a fire does not produce visible smoke, such as heat tabs, the shelter must still be vented. See Figure 13.24 for placement of ventilation holes in the snow cave. If a fire is to be placed outside the shelter, the opening of the shelter should be placed 90 degrees to the prevailing wind. This will reduce the chances of sparks and smoke being blown into the shelter if the wind should reverse direction in the morning and evening, which frequently occurs in mountainous areas. The best fire-to-shelter distance is approximately 3 feet. One place where it would not be wise to build a fire is near an aircraft or vehicle wreckage, especially if it is being used as a shelter. The possibility of igniting spilled lubricants or fuels is great. IP may decide instead to use materials from the aircraft or vehicle to add to a shelter located a safe distance from the crash or abandoned site. If IP are going to use a parachute or other porous materials, They should remember that pitch and tightness apply to shelters designed to shed rain and snow. Porous materials will not shed moisture unless they are stretched tightly at an angle of sufficient pitch, which will encourage runoff instead of penetration. An angle of 40 to 60 degrees is recommended for the pitch of the shelter. The material stretched over the framework should be wrinkle-free and tight. IP should not touch the material when water is running over it, as this will break the surface tension at that point and allow water to drip into the shelter. Select, collect, and prepare all materials needed before the actual construction. This includes framework, covering, bedding, or insulation, and implements used to secure the shelter, dead men, lines, stakes, etc. 1. For shelters with wooden framework, the poles or wood selected should have all rough edges and stubs removed. This will reduce the chances of the fabric being ripped, as well as eliminate the chances of injury to IP. 2. When a tree is selected as natural shelter, leave some or all of the branches in place on the outer side of the tree, as they will make a good support structure for the rest of the shelter parts. 3. Many materials can be used as framework coverings. Some can provide both framework and covering, such as bark peeled off dead trees, boughs cut off trees, bamboo, palm fronds, grasses, and other vegetation cut or woven into desired patterns. 4. If parachute material is to be used, it must be modified slightly. IP should remove all of the lines from the parachute and then cut it to size. This will eliminate bunching and wrinkling and reduce leakage. Site preparation should include brushing away rocks and twigs from the sleeping area and cutting back overhanging vegetation. To actually construct the shelter, begin with the framework. The framework is very important. It must be strong enough to support the weight of the covering and precipitation buildup of snow. It must also be sturdy enough to resist strong wind gusts. 1. For natural shelters, branches may be securely placed against trees or other natural objects. The support poles or branches can then be placed and/or attached depending on their function. 2. The pitch of the shelter is determined by the framework. A 60-degree pitch is optimum for shedding precipitation and providing shelter room. 3. After the basic framework has been completed, IP can apply and secure the framework covering. The care and techniques used to apply the covering will determine the effectiveness of the shelter in shedding precipitation. 4. If using parachute material, stretch the center seam tight, then work from the back of the shelter to the front, alternating sides and securing the material to stakes or framework by using buttons and lines. Stretch the material tight by pulling the material 90 degrees to the wrinkles. If material is not stretched tight, any moisture will pool in the wrinkles and leak into the shelter. 5. If natural materials are to be used for the covering, the shingle method should be used. Start at the bottom and work towards the top of the shelter, overlapping the bottom of each piece over the top of the preceding piece. This will allow water to drain off. The material should be placed on the shelter in sufficient quantity so that it cannot be seen through from the inside. An immediate action shelter is one which can be erected quickly with minimal effort, for example, from raft, aircraft parts, parachutes, pollen, or plastic material. Natural formations can also shield IP from the elements immediately, to include overhanging ledges, fallen logs, caves, and tree wells. Regardless of type, the shelter must provide whatever protection is needed and, with a little ingenuity, it should be possible for IP to protect themselves and do so quickly. In some instances, immediate action shelters may have to serve as permanent shelters for IP. Situate the shelter in areas which afford maximum protection from precipitation and wind and use the basic shelter principles noted above. If shelter is needed, IP should remember to use an existing shelter if at all possible. Improvise on natural shelters and construct new shelters only if necessary. Multi-person life rafts may be the only immediate or long-term shelter available. In this situation, multi-person life rafts must be deployed in the quickest manner possible to ensure maximum advantages are attained. Anchor the raft for retention during high winds and use additional boughs, grasses, etc. For ground insulation, immediate action should be to use the whole parachute. cloth material, padding, or other man-made items, until conditions allow for improvising. A sleeping bag can be improvised by using 4 gores of parachute material or an equivalent amount of other materials. Figure 13.3. The material should be folded in half lengthwise and sewn at the foot. To measure the length, the IP should allow an extra 6 to 10 inches in addition to the I.P.'s height. The 2 ridges can then be sewed together. The 2 sections of the bag can be filled with cattail down, goat's beard lichen, dry grass, insulation from aircraft walls, etc. The stuffed sleeping bag should then be quilted to keep the insulation from shifting. The bag can be folded in half lengthwise in the foot and open edges sewn. The length and width can be adjusted for the IP. Shelters of this type should be easy to construct and or dismantle in a short period of time. IP should consider this type of shelter only when they are not immediately concerned with getting out of the elements. Shelters of this type include A-frames, simple shade shelters, TPs, sod shelters, and snow shelters, including tree pit shelters. One way to build an A-frame shelter is to use a parachute or other material for the covering. There are as many variations of this shelter as there are builders. The procedures here will, if followed carefully, result in the completion of a safe shelter that will meet IP's needs. For an example of this and other A-frame shelters: 1 12 to 18 foot long sturdy ridgepole with all projections cleaned off. 2 bipod poles, approximately 7 feet long. Parachute material, normally 5 or 6 gores, or other natural or man-made material. Suspension lines or cord. Buttons or small objects placed behind gathers of material to provide a secure way of affixing suspension line to the material. Approximately 14 stakes, approximately 10 inches long. 1. Lash equipment, the 2 bipod poles together at eye level height. 2. Place the ridgepole, with the large end on the ground, into the bipod formed by the poles and secure with a square lash. 3. The bipod structure should be 90 degrees to the ridgepole and the bipod poles should be spread out to an approximate equilateral triangle of a 60-degree pitch. A piece of line can be used to measure this. 1. Tie off approximately 2 feet of the apex in a nut and tuck this under the butt end of the ridgepole. Use half hitches and clove hitches to secure the material to the base of the pole. 2. Place the center radial seam of the parachute piece or the center of the fabric on the ridgepole. After pulling the material taut, use half hitches and clove hitches to secure the fabric to the front of the ridgepole. 3. Scribe or draw a line on the ground from the butt of the ridgepole to each of bipod poles. Stake the fabric down, starting at the rear of the shelter and alternately staking from side to the shelter front. Use a sufficient number of stakes to ensure the parachute material is wrinkle-free. 4. Stakes should be slanted or inclined away from the direction of pull. When tying off with a clove hitch, the line should pass in front of the stake first and then pass under itself to allow the button line to be pulled 90 degrees to the wrinkle. A sturdy, smooth ridgepole long enough to span the distance between 2 sturdy trees. Support poles, 10 feet long. Stakes, lines, and buttons. Covering material. Assembling the framework. 1. Lash the ridgepole, between 2 suitable trees, on the shelter side, about chest or shoulder high. 2. Lay the roof support poles against ridgepole from the ridgepole side of shelter so the roof support poles in the ground are at approximately a 60-degree angle. The roof support poles should push the ridgepole against the trees. Lash the roof support poles to the ridgepole. Application of fabric. 1. Place the middle seam of the fabric on the middle support pole with lower lateral band along the ridgepole. 2. Tie off the middle and both sides of the lower lateral band approximately 8 to 10 inches from the ridgepole. 3. Stake the middle of the rear of the shelter first, and then alternate from side to side. 4. The stakes that go up the sides to the front should point to the front of the shelter. This shelter type has many variations. Example. One example is to use 4 trees or vertical poles in a rectangular pattern a little taller and a little wider than the IP, keeping in mind the IP will also need protection for equipment. 1. Select 4 trees or vertical poles in a rectangular pattern a little taller and a little wider than the IP, keeping in mind the IP will also need protection for equipment. 2. Square/2 long, sturdy poles between the trees or vertical poles, one on each side of the intended shelter. 3. Secure cross pieces across the 2 horizontal poles at 6 to 12-inch intervals. This forms the platform on which a natural mattress may be constructed. 4. Cover with an insect net of parachute material or other fabric. 5. Construct a roof over the structure using A-frame building techniques. 6. The roof should be waterproofed with hatching laid bottom to top in a thick shingle fashion. Shelters can also be built using 3 trees in a triangular pattern. At the foot of the shelter, 2 poles are joined to 1 tree. A variation of the platform-type shelter is the peri-platform. A quick and comfortable bed is made by simply wrapping material around the 2 frame poles. Another method is to roll poles in the material in the same manner as for an improvised stretcher. Various para-hammocks and hammocks made of other fabrics can also be made. However, they are more involved than a simple framework wrapped with material and not quite as comfortable. The debris nest is a small life-saving sleeping system, designed to protect individuals from the elements. It uses the old principle do as the animals do. Although primarily designed as a sleeping system, the debris nest can be used as an emergency shelter. With only a waterproof tarp, the IP can survive in either a permissive or non-permissive isolating event. The key principles of a good debris nest are: cold protection. Nest is built small so it can be warmed by body heat. Precipitation protection. Nest has a waterproof covering or is constructed in a natural protected location. Wind protection. Nest is designed to allow no air from outside to move into or through except for the head area. The debris nest consists of dry insulation in a protected covering that an individual can crawl into. It is constructed in such a way as to be warmed primarily by the occupant's body heat. Although heated stones or other heated heavy objects can be added for additional warmth, there are many ways an IP can construct a debris nest depending on the environmental conditions and the materials available. If conditions are cold and the IP is in a permissive isolating event, a fire should be built before beginning the shelter construction. If the situation allows, choose locations to build a debris nest that provide protection from precipitation and air movement. Examples are dumpsters, use care in extreme cold, the crawl spaces in buildings, crevice of rocks, an eroded embankment, large fallen tree, or in a tree well. Possible dry materials that may be used for insulation include grasses, ferns, evergreen boughs, mosses and lichens, clothing and other cloth-type materials. Some examples include: if an IP is in a coniferous forest, the soft bole and dry pine needles can be piled up, or in a deciduous forest, the dry leaves can be used. In an urban environment, IP may be able to find a large heavy-duty plastic bag, cardboard box, or container that could be filled with dry shredded papers, cloth, or available dry vegetation. In a cold desert, a nest may be constructed using dry grasses and available shrubs. Possible nest cover materials should be non-porous to provide protection from the cold. Body heat can be captured in the nest, wind, and precipitation. Examples are tarp, EVCs. Multiple EVCs can be duct taped together, large peeled bark from dead trees, thatched palm fronds, fallen logs, dumpsters, use care in extreme cold, wax-coated or plastic-covered cardboard, and the crawl spaces in buildings. The teepee is an excellent shelter for protection from wind, rain, cold, and insects. Cooking, eating, sleeping, resting, signaling, and washing can all be done without going outdoors. The teepee, whether 9-pole, 1-pole, or no-pole improvised shelter, provides adequate ventilation to build an inside fire. With a small fire inside, the shelter also serves as a signal at night. The potential drawbacks of the teepee that must be considered by the IP are the large amount of time and materials required in its construction. Materials needed: suspension line, parachute material, normally 14 gauze are suitable. Spread out the 14-gore section of parachute and cut off all lines at the lower lateral band, leaving about 18 inches of line attached. All other suspension lines should be stripped from the parachute. Sew 2 smoke flaps, made from 2 large panels of parachute material, at the apex of the 14-gore section on the outside seams. Attach suspension line with a bowline in the end to each smoke flap. The ends of the smoke flap poles will be inserted in these stakes. Although any number of poles may be used, 11 poles, smoothed off, each about 20 feet long, will normally provide adequate support. Assume 11 poles are used. Adjust instructions if different numbers are used. 1. Lay 3 poles on the ground with the butts even. Stretch the canopy along the poles. The lower lateral band should be 4 to 6 inches from the bottoms of the poles before the stretching takes place. Mark one of the poles at the apex point. 2. Lash the 3 poles together, 5 to 10 inches above the marked area. A shear lash is effective for this purpose. These poles will form the tripod. 3. Scribe a circle approximately 12 feet in diameter in the shelter area and set the tripod so the butts of the poles are evenly spaced on the circle. 5 of the remaining 8 poles should be placed so the butts are evenly spaced around the 12-foot circle and the tops are laid in the apex of the tripod to form the smallest apex possible. If IP fall into water, they should keep moving and should not remove footwear until they were in a shelter or beside a fire. At night, IP should arrange dry spare clothing loosely round and under the shoulders and hip to help keep the body warm. Wet clothes should never be worn into the sleeping bag. The moisture destroys the insulation value of the bag. 1. Stretch the parachute material or other fabric along the tie pole. Using the suspension line attached to the middle radial seam, tie the lower lateral band to the tie pole 6 inches from the butt end. Stretch the material along the middle radial seam and tie it to the tie pole using the suspension line at the apex. Lay the tie pole onto the shelter frame with the butt along the 12-foot circle and the top and the apex formed by the other poles. The tie pole should be placed directly opposite the proposed door. 2. Move the canopy material, both sides of it, from the tie pole around the framework and tie the lower lateral band together and stick it at the door. The front can now be sewn or pegged closed, leaving 3 to 4 feet for a door. A sewing ladder can be made by lashing steps up the front of the teepee. 3. Enter the shelter and move the butts of the poles outward to form a more perfect circle and until the fabric is relatively tight and smooth. 4. Tighten the fabric and remove remaining wrinkles. Start staking directly opposite the door and alternate from side to side, pulling the material down into the front of the shelter. Use clove hitches or similar knots to secure the material to the stakes. 5. Insert the final 2 poles into the loops on the smoke flaps. The teepee is now finished. 6. One improvement which could be made to the teepee is the installation of a liner. This will allow a draft for a fire without making the occupants cold, since there may be a slight gap between the lower lateral band and the ground. A liner can be affixed to the inside of the teepee by taking the remaining 14-gore piece of material and firmly staking the lower lateral band directly to the ground all the way around, leaving room for the door. The area where the liner and door meet may be sewn up. The rest of the material is brought up the inside walls and affixed to the poles with buttons. Materials needed. Use a 14-gore section of canopy. Strip the shroud lines leaving 16 to 18-inch lengths at the lower lateral band, or another type of material. Stakes. Inner core and needle. 1. Select a shelter site and scribe a circle about 14 feet in diameter on the ground. 2. The parachute material or other fabric is staked to the ground using the lines attached at the lower lateral band. After deciding where the shelter door will be located, stake the first line, from the lower band, down securely. Proceed around the scribed line and stake down all the lines from the lateral band, making sure the material is stretched taut before the line is staked down. 3. Once all the lines are staked down, loosely attach the center pole, and, through trial and error, Determine the point at which the parachute material will be pulled tight. Once the center pull is placed upright, securely attach the material at this point. 4. Using a suspension line, or inner core, sew the end gores together, leaving 3 or 4 feet for a door. For this shelter, the 14 gores of material are prepared the same way. A line is attached to the apex and thrown over a tree limb, etc., and tied off. The lower lateral band is then staked down starting opposite the door around a 12 to 14 foot circle. A framework covered with sod provides a shelter which is warm in cold weather and easily made waterproof and insect-proof in the summer. The framework for a sod shelter must be strong, and it can be made of driftwood, poles, willow, etc. Sod, with a heavy growth of grass or weeds, should be used since the roots tend to hold the soil together. Cutting about 2 inches of soil along with the grass is sufficient. The size of the blocks is determined by the strength of the individual. A sod shelter is strong and fireproof. In tropical areas, IP should establish a shelter site on a knoll or high spot in an open area set well back from any swamps or marshy areas. The ground in these areas is drier, and there may be a breeze which will result in fewer insects. A thick bamboo clump or matted canopy of vines recover reflects the smoke from the shelter site and discourages insects. This cover will also keep the extremely heavy early morning dew off the bedding. Insects are discouraged by smudge fires. In addition, a hammock made from parachute or other material will keep the IP off the ground and help ward off ants, spiders, leeches, scorpions, and other pests. In the wet jungle, shelter from dampness is needed. If the IP stays with the aircraft or vehicle, it could be used for shelter. Covering openings with netting, parachute, or other cloth will provide protection from mosquitoes. A good rain shelter can be made by constructing an A-frame type shelter and shingling it with a thickness of palm or other broadleaf plants, pieces of bark, and mats of grass. The extremes of heat and cold must be considered in hot areas, as most can become very cold during the night. The major problem for IP will be escaping the heat and sun rays. Natural shelters in these areas are often limited to the shade of cliffs and the lee sides of hills, dunes, or rock formations. In some desert mountains, it is possible to find good rock shelters or cave-like protection under tumbled blocks of rocks which have fallen from cliffs. Use care to ensure that these blocks are in areas void of future rock-falling activity and free from animal hazards. Vegetation, if any exists, is usually stunted and armed with thorns. It may be possible to stay in the shade by moving around the vegetation as the sun moves. The hottest part of the day may offer few shadows because the sun is directly overhead. Parachute material or other fabric draped over bushes or rocks will provide some shade. Materials which can be used in the construction of desert shelters include sand, though difficult to work with when loose, may be made into pillars by using sandbags made from parachute or any available cloth. Rock. Vegetation such as sagebrush, creosote bushes, juniper trees, and desert gourd vines are valuable building materials. Parachute canopy and suspension lines. The shelter should be made of dense material or have numerous layers to reduce or stop dangerous ultraviolet rays. The colors of the parachute materials used make a difference as to how much protection is provided from ultraviolet radiation. As a general rule, the order of preference should be to use as many layers as practical in the order of orange, green, tan, and white. The material should be kept approximately 12 to 18 inches above the individual. This allows the air to cool the underside of the material. Aircraft or vehicle parts and life rafts can also be used for shade shelters. IP may use sections of the wing, tail, or fuselage to provide shade. However, the interior of the aircraft or vehicle will quickly become superheated and should be avoided as a shelter. An inflatable raft can be tilted against a raft paddle or natural object such as a bush or a rock to provide relief from the sun. The roof of a desert shelter should be multi-layered so the resulting airspace reduces the inside temperature of the shelter. The layers should be separated 12 to 18 inches apart. The floor of the shelter should be placed about 18 inches above or below the desert surface to increase the cooling effect. The sides of shelters should be movable in order to protect IP during cold and/or windy periods and to allow for ventilation during hot periods. In warmer deserts, white parachute or other light-colored material should be used as an outer layer to reflect heat. Orange or sage green material should be used as an inner layer for protection from ultraviolet rays. In cooler areas, multiple layers of material should be used with sage green or orange material as the outer layer to absorb heat. In a hot desert, shelters should be built away from large rocks which store heat during the day. IP may need to move to the rocky areas during the evening to take advantage of the warmth heated rocks radiate. The teepee is an excellent shelter for protection from wind, rain, cold, and insects. Cooking, eating, sleeping, resting, signaling, and washing can all be done without going outdoors. The teepee, whether 9-pole, 1-pole, or no-pole improvised shelter provides adequate ventilation to build an inside fire. With a small fire inside, the shelter also serves as a signal at night. The potential drawbacks of the teepee that must be considered by the IP are the large amount of time and materials required in its construction. Materials needed. Suspension line. Parachute material, normally 14 gauges are suitable. Spread at the 14 gauge section of parachute and cut off all lines at the lower lateral band, leaving about 18 inches of line attached. All other suspension lines should be stripped from the parachute. Sew 2 smoke flaps, made from 2 large panels of parachute material, at the apex of the 14 gauge section on the outside seams. Attach suspension line with a bowline in the end to each smoke flap. The ends of the smoke flap poles will be inserted in these stakes. Although any number of poles may be used, 11 poles, smoothed off, each about 20 feet long, will normally provide adequate support. 1. Determine the size of the shelter based off the number of persons in your party. If alone, use the considerations discussed earlier for the appropriate size. 2. Dig out the chosen area, leaving 12 inches of snow on the ground. This will provide insulation. 3. Fill in the hole with the snow that was just dug up and mound the snow to chest height. 4. Allow the snow to set up for a minimum of 90 minutes. Longer times may be required based off the ambient air temperature. 5. Hollow out the interior of the shelter with a snow shovel, seed pan, or improvised digging tool, until the walls are 10 to 12 inches thick. As a general rule, snow looks bluish when the 10-12 inches of thickness is achieved. 6. If possible, create a low area at the entrance to act as a cold well or cold sump. A cold well or cold sump is the lowest point in the shelter, allowing cold air to drop below the sleeping area of the IP. 7. Ensure there is proper ventilation by creating a vent hole in the roof of the shelter. Use a ski pole, knife, or stick to puncture a hole through the snow. The hole should be 2 inches in diameter. 8. To finish out the shelter, create a door plug by mounting snow in a piece of material large enough to seal the opening. Tie off the material so snow doesn't fall out, and pull into the entrance. Snow cave example. Fire trench example. In tree-covered areas, sufficient natural shelter building materials are normally available. Caution is required. Shelters built near rivers and streams may get caught should the riverbanks overflow. Shelters which are suitable for tree-line type areas include thermal A-frame example, double lean-to example, fan example, willow frame example, tree well example. No matter what type of shelter is used, the use of thermal principles and insulation in Arctic shelters is required. Heat radiates from bare ground and from ice masses over water. This means that shelter areas on land should be dug down to bare earth if possible. A minimum of 6 to 12 inches of insulation above the IP is needed to retain heat. All openings except ventilation holes should be sealed to avoid heat loss. Leaving vent holes open is especially important if heat-producing devices are used. Candles, sterno, or small oil lamps produce carbon monoxide. In addition to the ventilation hole through the roof, another may be required at the door to ensure adequate circulation of the air. As a general rule, if IP cannot see their breath, the snow shelter is too warm and should be cooled down to preclude melting and dripping. Regardless of how cold it may get outside, the temperature inside a small well-constructed snow cave will probably not be lower than -10 F. Body heat alone can raise the temperature of a snow cave 45 degrees above the outside air. A burning candle will raise the temperature 4 degrees. Burning sterno, small size, 2 to half an ounce, will raise the cave temperature about 28 degrees. However, since they cannot be heated many degrees above freezing, snow shelters provide a rather rugged life. Once the inside of the shelter glazes over with ice, this layer of ice should be removed by chipping it off or a new shelter built, since ice reduces the insulating quality of a shelter. Maintain the old shelter until the new one is constructed. It will provide protection from the wind. An aircraft or vehicle should not be used as a shelter when temperatures are below freezing except in high wind conditions. Even then, a thermal shelter should be constructed as soon as the conditions improve. The aircraft or vehicle will not provide adequate insulation, and the floor will usually become icy and hazardous. Thermal shelters use a layering system consisting of the frame, parachute or other material, boughs or shrubs, and snow. The framework must be sturdy enough to support the cover and insulation. A door block should be used to minimize heat loss. Insulation should be added at all sleeping areas. If a barren land-type shelter is being built with snow as the only material, a long knife or digging tool is a necessity. It normally takes 2 to 3 hours of hard work to dig a snow cave. IP should dress lightly while digging and working. They can easily become overheated and dampen their clothing with perspiration, which will rapidly turn to ice. If possible, construct all shelter types to have their openings 90 degrees to the prevailing wind. The entrance to the shelter should also be screened with snow blocks stacked in an L shape. Snow on the sea ice, suitable for cutting into blocks, will usually be found in the lee of pressure ridges or ice hummocks. The packed snow is often so shallow that the snow blocks have to be cut out horizontally. No matter which shelter is used, IP should take a digging tool into the shelter at night time to cope with the great amount of snow which may block the door during the night. An IP should limit the number of shelter entrances to help conserve heat. Fuel is generally scarce in the Arctic. To conserve fuel, it is important to keep the shelter entrance sealed as much as possible. When it is necessary to go outside the shelter, activities such as gathering fuel, snow or ice for melting, etc., should be done. To expedite matters, a trash receptacle may be kept inside the door, and equipment may be stored in the entryway. Necessities which cannot be stored inside may be kept just outside the door. A standard practice in snow shelter living is for people to relieve themselves indoors when possible. This practice conserves body heat. If the snowdrift is large enough to dig connecting snow caves, one may be used as a toilet room. If not, aluminum cans may be used for urinals, and snow blocks for solid waste, fecal matter. IP needs shelter against rain and insects. Modify shelters discussed to provide additional protection as needed. Once a shelter is constructed, it must be maintained. Additional modifications may make the shelter more effective and comfortable. With parachute or fabric material shelters, Indian lacing the front of the shelter to the bipod will tighten the shelter. A door may help block the wind and keep insects out. Other modifications may include a fire reflector, porch or work area, or another hole addition such as an opposing lean-to. Indian lacing is the sewing or lacing of the lower lateral band of a parachute within a core or line which is secured to the bipod poles. Small holes, 6 to 8 inches apart, should be cut in either the lower lateral band material or at least 1 inch from the lower edge of other material. Parachute suspension line or other cord can then be girth hitched to the first hole, run around the frame and laced through the next hole. Continue until the line is laced around frame and through each hole. Starting at the first hole, pull tension around the frame and draw slack through next hole. Continue process until line is tight and slack, Wrinkles are removed. Tie off end of line. A rain fly can also be constructed to reduce the amount of precipitation that penetrates shelter material. 2 layers of material, 4 to 6 inches apart, will create a more effective water-repellent covering. Even during hard rain, the outer layer only lets a mist penetrate if it is pulled tight. The inner layer will then channel off any moisture which may penetrate. This layering of material also creates a dead air space that covers the shelter. This is especially beneficial in cold areas when the shelter is enclosed. Insulation beds can be constructed using natural or man-made materials. As a general rule, beds should be 6 to 12 inches thick if being constructed of natural materials. When using man-made thermal or non-conductive materials, it may not be necessary to use as much. In addition to the sleeping bag, some form of ground insulation is advisable. An insulation mat will help insulate the survivor from ground moisture and the cold. Any non-poisonous plants such as ferns and grasses will suffice. Leaves from a deciduous tree make a comfortable bed. If available, extra clothing, seat cushions, aircraft insulation, rafts, and parachute material may be used. In a coniferous forest, boughs from the trees will do well if the bed is constructed properly. The survivor should start at the foot of the proposed bed and stick the cut ends in the ground at about a 45-degree angle and very close together. The completed bed should be slightly wider and longer than the body. If the ground is frozen, a layer of dead branches can be used on the ground with the green boughs placed in the dead branches, similar to sticking them in the ground. Spruce boughs have many sharp needles and can cause some discomfort. Also, the needles on various types of pines are generally located on the ends of the boughs, and it would take an abundance of pine boughs to provide comfort and insulation. Fir boughs, on the other hand, have an abundance of needles all along the boughs, and the needles are rounded. These boughs are excellent for beds, providing comfort and insulation. Outer clothing makes good mattress material. A parka makes a good foot bag. The shirt and inner trousers may be rolled up for a pillow. Socks and insoles can be separated and aired in the shelter. Drying may be completed in the sleeping bag by stowing around the hip. This drying method should only be used as a last resort. Keeping the sleeping bag clean, dry, and fluffed will give maximum warmth. To dry the bag, it should be turned inside out, frost beaten out, and warmed before the fire, taking care that it doesn't burn. To keep moisture from breath from wetting the sleeping bag, a moisture cloth should be improvised from a piece of clothing, a towel, or parachute fabric. It can then be lightly wrapped around the head in such a way that the breath is trapped inside the cloth. A piece of fabric dries easier than a sleeping bag. If cold is experienced during the night, IP should exercise by fluttering their feet up and down or by beating the inside of the bag with their hands. Food or hot liquids can be helpful. Thank you for watching.
Parti, te lo comando, fuggi il paterno lido e cerca altrove sicuro asil.
Ahimè, pietosa principessa, mi conforti. Ti conforti, e come? Ancor mi salta l'indegna. Tranquilla, me ne andrò. Ma dove?
t'amo uccide, perché t'amo uccide. Mi si divide, mi si divide, soffrir, soffrir, non si può, soffrir, soffrir, non si può. Peggio di morte, si gran dolore, più fiera sorte della soffrir più non si può, soffrir più non si può.